June 15, 1944. Dawn broke gray over the southern coast of England. The air smelled faintly of oil, gunpowder, and the sea. Beneath low clouds, soldiers manned their guns among the hedgerows and chalk hills of Kent. They'd been awake for days, nerves frayed, eyes red from the constant hum that haunted the night. The hum was growing again now, a rattling, stuttering drone, like a motorcycle engine coughing across the sky. Men looked up and saw it. A small, stubby-winged craft leaving a pale ribbon of smoke behind it. The sound grew, throbbed, and then silence. The engine cut off. In that moment, every man froze. They knew what came next. The V-1's impact sent a dull, rolling shockwave across the fields, rattling tin huts and shaking the ground beneath their boots. In London, miles away, people had already learned to count between the silence and the blast. When the engine stopped, you had 12 seconds. Enough time to realize it might be you. The new terror had a name. Vergeltungswaffe 1, the vengeance weapon 1. A flying bomb. Hitler's promise of retaliation for the D-Day landings. The first of them had fallen just 2 days earlier, striking Grove Road in East London. It left a crater 30 feet wide, killing 6 and wounding dozens. The press called it a pilotless plane. Civilians gave it a nickname that would stick: the Doodlebug. Within a week, hundreds were crossing the channel every day. They were crude but terrifyingly effective. A pulse jet engine, a ton of explosives, and a gyroscopic autopilot that sent them speeding toward the heart of Britain at more than 400 miles per hour. At first, people joked. The strange buzzing sounded ridiculous, like a tin kettle about to burst. Some said the Germans must be desperate to rely on such toys. But soon the laughter faded. The Doodlebugs were relentless. They struck at night and at dawn, when the mist hugged the Thames and the sirens echoed through sleeping neighborhoods. Londoners began to dread the moment the noise cut out. Silence had become the sound of death. British anti-aircraft gunners did their best, firing thousands of shells into the air every day. The sky over Kent and Sussex filled with smoke bursts and black shrapnel trails. But the results were grim. The V-1s flew low and fast. Too fast for accurate tracking, too low for radar to help much. By late June, gunners were bringing down only 1 in every 100. One officer wrote bitterly, "We were shooting at ghosts." If this kind of story grips you, a quick click on the like and subscribe button tells us to make more of them. It seemed nothing could stop them. Fighters like the new Hawker Tempest and the Spitfire Mark XIV began to hunt them, racing to intercept at the edge of the channel. Pilots learned to creep up alongside the flying bombs and nudge them off course with a wingtip, sending them tumbling into fields or the sea. But there were simply too many. Even on the best days, hundreds slipped through. London burned anew, and each night more families fled to the underground for shelter, huddling beside rails while the city above shuddered under explosions. The Germans, in their confidence, believed they'd found a miracle weapon. Cheap, unstoppable, and terrifying. Each launch ramp could hurl 1 V-1 every few minutes. Their engineers boasted that England would be reduced to rubble within weeks. It was vengeance, they said, for Cologne, Hamburg, and Berlin. Yet that arrogance was about to collide with one of the most extraordinary technological secrets of the war. A device so small it fit in the palm of a hand, but so advanced it changed the course of defense forever. It was called the VT Fuze, variable time. A tiny, self-contained radar transmitter and receiver built into the nose of an artillery shell. When the shell approached an object, an aircraft, a bomb, anything solid, the radio waves bounced back, triggering detonation at the perfect distance for maximum effect. In an instant, guesswork was gone. No more timing dials, no more fuses set by hand. The shell itself knew when to explode, but making it work had seemed impossible. When the idea was proposed in 1940 by an American physicist named Merle Tuve, even his own colleagues called it madness. The electronics of the day were delicate, full of fragile glass vacuum tubes. Firing a shell from a gun meant slamming it with forces 20,000 times greater than gravity. A single jolt could shatter a filament or jar a circuit loose. "You might as well put a radio inside a firecracker," one engineer scoffed. Yet Tuve's team, working under the National Defense Research Committee, refused to give up. They built tubes small enough to fit inside a thimble and rugged enough to survive the shock. They sealed them with nitrogen, tested them in centrifuges, and fired them again and again. Each improvement was a tiny miracle. By 1942, they had a design that worked. When tested at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, a shell fitted with the new fuse detonated just yards from a drone target, shredding it mid-air. Witnesses were stunned. The shell didn't need to hit, only to sense. Still, the technology was so secret it was guarded more closely than even radar. It was forbidden to use over land for fear that an unexploded shell might be recovered by the enemy. If a ship carrying VT fuses was sunk, sailors were ordered to destroy every remaining one. The U.S. Navy deployed it first in the Pacific, where it proved devastating against Japanese aircraft, bursting near enough to rip wings from kamikaze planes before they could strike. Then came June 1944, D-Day. As the Allies fought to secure Normandy, a new crisis erupted over Britain. The V-1 campaign threatened to cripple morale and logistics. The British government pleaded for help. At the highest levels, it was decided the secret weapon could be risked. America sent thousands of VT Fuze across the Atlantic in crates marked only radio equipment. By mid-July, the first shipments reached anti-aircraft batteries along the coast. The gunners didn't know the details, only that these shells were special. They were told not to tamper with them, not to ask questions. The fuses were to be used only against V-1s, and every empty shell casing was to be returned for inspection. On August 4, 1944, the experiment began. At dawn, radar screens near Dover lit up with incoming targets. Another wave of flying bombs racing toward London. Orders went out. Engage with new ammunition. Dozens of guns opened fire. This time, something was different. An observer watching from the command post wrote that the air suddenly blossomed with fire. Shells detonated close enough to tear the V-1s apart. One after another, the flying bombs burst mid-air, raining fragments into the channel. Gunners stared, mouths open. After weeks of futility, their weapons seemed to have come alive. It was as though the shells were thinking, a crewman later said. By the end of that single day, 82% of all V-1s that entered the new defense zone had been destroyed. The statistic seemed impossible, but it was true. The secret American fuse had turned the tide overnight. For the men on the ground, the change was immediate and emotional. Sergeant Eric Stevens of the Royal Artillery recalled watching a line of V-1s explode in the air and realizing he wouldn't have to hear that dreaded silence again. "It was the first time we felt we were ahead of them," he said. The Germans were bewildered. Reports from occupied France mentioned that their V-1s were being destroyed with uncanny precision. They blamed radar-controlled guns, new ammunition, or even magnetic fields. None guessed the truth, that each shell carried a microscopic radar of its own. The numbers were staggering. Before the VT Fuze, it took over 2,500 shells to bring down a single V-1. After its introduction, the average fell to under 100. The batteries along the coast soon averaged 1 kill for every 70 rounds fired. For comparison, that was an improvement equivalent to increasing firepower 30-fold overnight, and the production behind it was just as astonishing. In hidden American factories, Crosley in Cincinnati, General Electric in Schenectady, Eastman Kodak in Rochester, assembly lines ran around the clock. Workers, many of them women, soldered microcomponents under magnifying lenses. Each plant produced up to 40,000 fuses a week. By war's end, more than 22 million had been made, enough to fill entire cargo holds. One factory alone consumed as much electricity as a small city. Every unit was a masterpiece of precision. A typical fuse contained miniature capacitors and transistors, hand-wound coils, and a tiny vacuum tube barely larger than a pencil eraser. Yet it had to function perfectly after being hurled from a cannon at supersonic speed. Quality control was relentless. Out of thousands produced, only a handful failed in the field. As August turned to September, the effect on the V-1 campaign was dramatic. British radar stations tracked ever fewer successful strikes. In June, 1 in every 2 V-1s launched reached London. By late August, fewer than 1 in 5 did. The threat was being strangled before it reached the city. The VT Fuze, the secret American invention, was now saving thousands of lives each week. In London, people began to notice the silence. Nights grew calmer. The underground stations, once crammed with families sleeping on blankets, began to empty. The newspapers reported a marked decline in flying bomb activity, though the real reason was still a closely guarded secret. Churchill himself called the fuse the most important new device since radar. For the German crews manning the launch ramps in northern France, the change was demoralizing. They had once boasted that their revenge weapons would terrorize Britain into surrender. Now they watched entire waves vanish before reaching the coast. Many began to suspect sabotage or mechanical faults. When Allied troops captured several sites in August, they found half-built ramps and abandoned bombs, testaments to a campaign collapsing under invisible resistance. For the Allied gunners, those weeks became a rhythm of noise and victory. The air smelled of cordite and sea salt. The guns fired until their barrels glowed red. Spent shell casings piled waist-high. One corporal recalled that the heat made the steel too hot to touch, and yet they kept firing, laughing between volleys, because for once, they were winning. Even so, the cost remained. Every V-1 that slipped through still carried tragedy. In the weeks before the system fully took hold, bombs struck hospitals, churches, and crowded streets. In total, the campaign killed more than 6,000 civilians. For many, the scars never faded. But without the VT Fuze, that number might have tripled. As the Allies advanced through France and the V-1 launch sites were overrun, the threat gradually faded. Hitler's scientists turned instead to the V-2 rocket, faster, higher, and unstoppable. But the brief era of the flying bomb had already left its mark. It had tested the limits of terror and technology, and in doing so, had revealed the future of warfare. The old doctrine of defense, of gunners relying on eyesight and guesswork, had died. In its place stood a new union of electronics and ordnance, of science and instinct. The VT Fuze represented the first step toward guided munitions, toward missiles that could think. It was, in a sense, the first smart weapon. After the war, the secrecy surrounding it slowly unraveled. Newspapers published stories of the shell that could see. Engineers who had worked in silence for years were finally honored. President Truman called the fuse one of the most outstanding scientific achievements of the war. Admiral Lewis Strauss went even further, ranking it second only to the atomic bomb in importance. For those who had lived through the V-1 onslaught, the gratitude was quieter, more personal. A London mother, interviewed years later, said, "We never knew what stopped them. One day they just stopped, and we could sleep again." Among captured German officers, the discovery was met with disbelief. Walter Dornberger, who had overseen parts of the V-weapons program, wrote in his memoirs that he had not thought such precision possible with current electronics. Others simply shook their heads, calling it unfair magic. Yet the real magic was human persistence, the patience of scientists who refused to accept limits, and the courage of the men who trusted shells they didn't understand. The VT Fuze stood as a testament to what cooperation could achieve. American science, British endurance, shared intelligence, all fused together, literally and figuratively, to defend a city under siege. Its influence reached far beyond the war. The principles developed for the fuse later guided peacetime technology. Radar altimeters, proximity sensors, even spacecraft landing systems. What had once destroyed became a foundation for exploration. And still, its wartime legacy carried weight. Those who had fired the shells never forgot the feeling, the sudden shift from helplessness to hope. "When they gave us the new fuses," one gunner said, "the sky changed. It was like someone had turned the lights on." By the winter of 1945, the guns fell silent. The last doodlebug sputtered out over a muddy field in Kent and crashed harmlessly among the frost. London, bruised but unbroken, began to rebuild. In workshops and laboratories, the scientists who had given the shells their unseen eyes turned to peacetime research. The secret American VT Fuze had fulfilled its purpose, not through destruction, but through the salvation it brought to a city that had suffered enough. In that summer of 1944, a handful of tiny circuits had rewritten the story of the air war. The Germans had unleashed vengeance from the sky, but in response, the Allies had built intelligence into steel. Knowledge had become armor. Science had become the shield. And when the smoke cleared, the numbers told the story better than any words. 82% of V-1s destroyed in a single day, thousands of lives spared, and a weapon so advanced the enemy could scarcely imagine it. Years later, as veterans gathered to remember those nights by the guns, one of them looked back and said softly, "We never saw the bombs we stopped. We only saw the flashes." But that was enough. Each flash meant a home still standing. So ends the story of the secret American VT Fuze, the silent guardian that turned fear into firelight, that shattered Hitler's vengeance in the skies above England, and that proved even in the darkest hours of war, human ingenuity could illuminate the night. If you believe these forgotten stories need to be remembered, subscribe to WW2 Action. By joining us, you help keep this history alive. Now tell us, what is your single biggest takeaway from this entire story? Share it with the community in the comments below.